The stale smell of mothballs and rotting paper in the basement archive was suddenly replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Ben felt the jagged edge of the stolen parchment biting into his ribs, hidden beneath a jacket that was now slick with cold sweat. Behind him, the heavy thud of a security guard's boots echoed off the concrete walls, a rhythmic, predatory sound that grew louder with every frantic heartbeat. One wrong step, and the forged seals he'd just uncovered would become his death warrant before he even reached the street. He burst into the humid July night, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as he hammered on a familiar door, his knuckles raw and bleeding. Inside, the woman he trusted most in the world stood in the soft glow of her kitchen, her expression unreadable as she watched him spill the city's darkest secrets across her polished table. As she reached out to slide the incriminating documents toward her, the shadow she cast against the wall seemed to grow, stretching over him like a trap. Ben realized too late that the silence of the town wasn't peace. It was a gag, and he had just handed over his only way to breathe. The humid haze of a Millfield July pressed against the basement windows of the municipal archive, thick and unyielding. Inside, the air remained stagnant, a heavy soup of decaying cellulose, mothballs, and the metallic tang of old ink. Benjamin Cartwright wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a jagged gray streak of coal dust across his skin. Under the jaundiced glow of a flickering fluorescent tube, Ben turned the brittle pages of the city's land registries. He labored over the preparation of year-end reports for the upcoming harvest festival, his fingers numbing from the repetitive motion of shifting heavy folders embossed with faded municipal crests. Every movement stirred a cloud of fine paper fibers into the air. The particles tickled his throat, forcing a hollow, dry cough from his chest. Steel shelving units stretched deep into the gloom, their shadows squeezing the narrow aisles. Ben stared at the rigid columns of figures until the ink blurred into a chaotic dance of black ants, his eyes burning from the relentless combination of fatigue and the airless heat of the subterranean vault. Ben reached for a cardboard box tucked into the lowest shelf, his muscles protesting the strain. He extracted a yellowed roll of parchment bound with a fraying length of twine that crumbled under his touch. On the scarred wooden surface of his desk, he unfurled an ancient cadastral map, its surface mottled with the tea-colored stains of rising damp. Ben traced the boundary of the communal meadow, a line of black India ink drawn with meticulous care a century ago. Beside it lay a fresh printout from the city planning office, where those same coordinates had shifted 100 meters to the east. His heart gave a dull, heavy thud against his ribs. Ben reached for his magnifying glass, leaning in until the bridge of his nose almost touched the paper. He scrutinized the seam where the sheets met. A hairline fracture in the grain of the paper, barely visible beneath a layer of fresh lacquer, betrayed a clumsy forgery. He compared the seals. The stamp on the new document appeared too sharp, the red ink unnaturally vivid against the aged background. His fingers trembled as he aligned a sheet of translucent tracing paper, bearing the Global Build Corporation logo over the map of the protected conservation zone. The geometric outlines of a proposed concrete plant sat perfectly atop the territory that had belonged to the citizens of Millfield for generations. Ben spotted the signatures of city officials scrawled directly over the faint watermarks that prohibited any form of development. A cold iron band of realization tightened around his chest. This was no clerical oversight or a simple mapping error. It was a calculated surgical strike against the green lungs of the city. Ben scanned the figures in the contract addendum, where zeros lined up in an endless, staggering queue. In the heavy silence of the archive, he heard only the ragged sound of his own breath. He understood then that behind this single sheet of paper stood millions of dollars and a bottomless well of human avarice. Ben cast a furtive glance toward the locked door of the basement before driving a utility knife into the spine of the folder. The blade crunched through the binding threads with a sound like breaking bone. Original sheets, bearing the authentic, weathered seals of the past, tumbled into his waiting hands. He feverishly shoved the documents beneath his shirt, the chill of the thick parchment biting into his skin. In their place, Ben inserted blank sheets of matching weight, smoothing the folder to mimic its previous volume. Sweat stung his eyes as he pulled the cloth ties into a tight knot. He slid the metal drawer shut, moving with agonizing slowness to prevent the steel from clattering. Every distant groan of the building's pipes made him flinch. Ben snatched his jacket from the back of the chair, draping it carefully to hide the unnatural bulge against his ribs, and began the long walk toward the archive's exit. At the main threshold of City Hall, a massive silhouette blocked his path. Security guard Bill Smith stepped into the center of the frame, planting a heavy palm against Ben's shoulder. Smith's eyes narrowed into suspicious slits, scanning Ben's frantic expression and the odd protrusion beneath his coat. The guard took a step forward, closing the distance until the air between them smelled of cheap tobacco and peppermint gum. Smith demanded to see the contents of his bag and ordered Ben to unbutton the jacket. Ben retreated, feeling the cold, unforgiving surface of the doorframe press into his spine. Smith's hand drifted toward the holster of his taser, and the air in the narrow hallway hummed with a sudden, sharp electrical tension. Ben clenched his fists, his mind racing to find a way around this living wall of muscle and authority. Smith lunged, grabbing Ben by the collar and jerking him forward with a violent snap. Ben threw his hands up in a reflexive shield, and his elbow connected with the guard's jaw with a dull, sickening thud. Smith let out a guttural growl, shoving Ben back against the wall. The force of the impact sent a desk lamp crashing to the floor, scattering pens and paperwork like shrapnel. Ben writhed in the guard's iron grip, his boots scuffing uselessly against the linoleum. Smith's heavy boot came down hard on Ben's foot, sending a white-hot flash of pain up his leg. Gritting his teeth, Ben delivered a short, sharp blow to the guard's midsection, forcing the air from Smith's lungs and causing him to double over for a fleeting second. The hallway filled with the sound of heavy grunting and the sharp rip of tearing fabric. Ben seized the opening, shoved Smith away with all his remaining strength, and bolted toward the glass doors leading to the street. Ben burst through the doors of City Hall, nearly colliding with a pedestrian on the sidewalk. The crisp evening air seared his lungs, but he refused to break his stride. He clamped his elbow tight against his ribs, feeling the sharp corners of the stolen documents dig into his side, like a reminder of his crime. The soles of his shoes hammered a frantic rhythm against the cobblestones, the sound echoing off the brick facades of the narrow alleys. He didn't dare look back, though the memory of Smith's roar and the heavy slam of the door still rang in his ears. His shadow danced wildly against the walls, breaking and stretching under the amber glow of the street lamps. Ben ducked into a dark archway, weaving through the urban labyrinth to scrub his trail. His heart hammered against his ribs like a panicked bird in a cage as he ran toward the flickering safety of the lights in Linda Hayes's windows. He skidded to a halt before Linda Hayes's front door, gasping for air that felt like broken glass in his throat. Ben's hands shook so violently that he struggled to press the doorbell. His face burned from a fresh scrape, and the sleeve of his jacket hung in a ragged, pathetic strip. He scanned the empty street, half expecting the blinding sweep of headlights to round the corner at any moment. Every tree in the manicured garden looked like a crouching predator in the gloom. Ben leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the door, trying to force the tremors from his knees. A single thought pulsed in his brain. Linda was the only one left who could hold this dangerous truth. He heard the muffled click of heels on the hardwood inside and straightened his posture, frantically smoothing the folder hidden beneath his coat. Linda Hayes opened the door, and Ben practically stumbled inside, spilling the documents onto her polished kitchen table before she could even offer a greeting. He jabbed a finger at the forged signatures, his voice reduced to a frantic, rattling whisper. Linda studied the cadastral maps with a clinical intensity, while Ben outlined the corruption, tracing the line of greed all the way to the mayor's office. He searched her face, looking for the spark of shared outrage or the comfort of a plan. His eyes shone with a feverish, desperate light. He believed that Linda, as the head of the council, would immediately summon an emergency commission to halt the construction. Ben gripped the edge of the table, bracing for the words that would end the deception. He watched as Linda slowly removed her glasses, her face sinking into a mask of deep, unreadable contemplation. Linda stepped closer and placed a soft, firm hand on Ben's shoulder, guiding him into a chair. Her voice was a calm, steady stream, the kind of tone used to soothe a frightened animal. She gestured toward the window, where the peaceful domestic lights of Millfield twinkled in the valley. Linda explained that a sudden, explosive scandal would shatter the city's fragile economy right on the eve of the festival. Ben watched her head tilt in a slow, sad arc as she painted a picture of riots, panicked investors, and ruined farmers. She convinced him that haste would only transform him from a whistleblower into a common provocateur. Ben listened to the relentless logic of her words, and his initial fire began to dampen under the immense weight of her authority. Linda smiled, and in that moment, the expression felt like an anchor in a storm. She reached across the table, her hand hovering over the folder, while her gray eyes remained locked on his. She whispered that the personal safe in her office was the most secure location in the county. Ben felt the documents slide away as she gently pulled them toward her side of the table. Linda promised him that she would personally spearhead the investigation the moment the Harvest Festival concluded and the public eye turned elsewhere. In her hands, Ben saw a guarantee of his own safety and the end of his solitary nightmare. She told him to go home, to sleep, to let her carry the burden of the coming fight. Ben looked down at his empty palms, feeling a strange, hollow lightness in his chest as the weight of the evidence left his possession. The sudden, violent scream of shattering glass tore through the silence of Ben's bedroom, jerking him upright in his tangled sheets. Shards of glass sprayed across the wooden floor like diamonds, glinting sharply in the pale moonlight. A heavy, red brick wrapped in coarse twine thudded onto the floorboards, coming to rest inches from his feet. Ben reached out with a trembling hand to unfurl the scrap of gray packing paper taped to the stone. Bold letters, crudely cut from newspaper headlines, formed a jagged message. Construction starts on time. The sharp scent of street dust and the biting night air rushed through the jagged hole in the window frame. Ben pulled the quilt tight against his chest, flinching as a tiny sliver of glass bit into the sole of his bare foot. He crept toward the window, pulling back the edge of the heavy curtain just enough to peer outside. On the far side of the street, tucked beneath the sprawling shadow of an old oak, sat a massive black SUV. The vehicle's polished finish reflected the orange glow of the street lamp, its interior hidden behind the impenetrable void of tinted glass. The engine hummed at a low, predatory idle, sending rhythmic puffs of gray exhaust into the air to vanish in the dark. Ben saw the tiny, red ember of a cigarette flare behind the glass and then slowly fade. The vehicle lurched forward, rolling silently past his fence before stopping again in the shadows of the next house, watching and waiting like a hunter in the tall grass. Ben burst into the cramped offices of the Millfield Gazette, clutching a folder of photocopies so tightly his knuckles turned white. The pervasive scent of printer's ink and old newsprint hit him like a physical wall. Editor Miller looked up from his desk, his face draining of color until it matched the grayish hue of spoiled milk. When Ben tried to spread the papers across a desk cluttered with manuscripts, Miller scrambled to his feet, knocking over a mug of cold, stagnant coffee. Miller's fingers dug into Ben's shoulders, physically spinning him back toward the exit. The editor hissed through his teeth, begging Ben to leave before they were seen together. The heavy oak door slammed shut, the lock clicking home with finality. Ben stood alone on the porch, staring at his empty hands while the morning commuters passed him by with total indifference. The gravel of the park path crunched under Ben's boots just before two men in camouflage jackets stepped from the thick juniper brush. A powerful shove to the chest sent Ben sprawling onto his knees, the rough stones tearing the skin of his palms. A heavy boot slammed into his ribs, forcing the air from his lungs in a ragged whistle. One of the hired men leaned in close, his breath a foul mix of garlic and raw metal. A fist to the cheekbone made the world explode into a kaleidoscope of white sparks. The attackers were methodical, landing precise blows to his stomach and thighs, their voices a low, rhythmic grunt as they reminded him that the archives were a place for the dead. Ben curled into a ball on the dirt, the metallic, salty taste of blood filling his mouth. Ben leaned heavily against the plastic shell of a public phone booth, leaving a smear of dark blood from his split lip on the receiver. His fingers fumbled with the buttons, his vision blurring as he dialed Linda's private number. When she finally answered, her voice was a cool, distant melody that didn't seem to match the gravity of his situation. He gasped out the details of the attack, his words tripping over each other in a frantic rush. Linda sighed, a sound of weary disappointment, and told him he was becoming hysterical. She suggested that perhaps the stress of the archive work had finally broken his grip on reality. Before he could protest, the line went dead, leaving him with nothing but the hollow hum of the dial tone and the cold realization that he was truly alone. The world returned to Ben in a haze of acrid smoke and the taste of old copper. He opened his eyes to find himself slumped behind the cracked windshield of his old Ford, the gray twilight blurring the edges of the dashboard. Tucked under the interior wiper blade was a crisp, white official form. Ben reached for it, his skull throbbing with a rhythmic, stabbing pain that synchronized with his heartbeat. The red header of the Millfield Psychiatric Institute burned like an open wound, and at the bottom sat Linda Hayes's elegant, flowing signature. Ben's nails dug into the paper as he read the words paranoid delusions and mandatory observation. A cold sweat tracked down his spine. Linda hadn't just taken his evidence, she had stolen his sanity in the eyes of the law. He twisted the key in the ignition, but the starter motor only gave a dry, metallic cough before dying. In the rearview mirror, Ben saw the rhythmic pulse of blue lights cutting through the evening fog. Two heavy ambulances and a police cruiser rolled onto his gravel driveway with predatory slowness. Orderlies in stiff white coats vaulted from the vehicles, unfurling a heavy canvas restraint sheet like a net for a wild animal. The police officers kept their hands hovering over their holsters as they formed a semicircle around the car. Ben watched one of the orderlies slide a glass syringe from a leather case, the needle catching a glint of the headlights. He yanked the door handle, praying the mechanism hadn't jammed in the collision. Ben hit the wet grass hard, rolling over the back gate just as the first flashlight beams swept the yard. The white veil of fog swallowed him whole, the dampness clinging to his face with the scent of rotting leaves. From a loudspeaker mounted on a nearby utility pole, a burst of static cleared into the rich, maternal voice of Linda Hayes. She was addressing the city, her words about a tragic mental collapse of a devoted civil servant echoing off the brick walls of the neighborhood. Ben listened as she accused him of stealing priceless historical relics. Her voice urged the citizens to be cautious of an unstable and dangerous man. He pressed his back against the rough masonry of an alleyway, feeling her voice strip away his identity, turning him into a hunted beast in his own town. He emerged near the central square, pulling a grime-streaked hood low over his brow. The rhythmic thud of hammers and the high-pitched scream of circular saws filled the air as workers in neon vests constructed the skeleton of the festival stage. Ben's eyes locked onto a public notice kiosk, where the glue on a new poster still glistened. There, he saw his own face, a cold, clinical photo from his personnel file that looked like a stranger. Beneath the image, bold black type warned the public of his violent tendencies. Ben watched a group of pedestrians recoil from the poster, while the construction crew exchanged nervous, hushed glances. The world had shrunk into a trap where every vertical surface screamed of his treachery. The skin over Ben's cheekbone throbbed, and a crust of dried blood pulled at his eyelid. He pushed open the glass door of a corner pharmacy, hoping for a bottle of antiseptic, but the chime of the bell made the elderly man behind the counter jump. Ben saw the pharmacist's eyes widen with a flash of pure terror as he recognized the face from the warnings. Without a word, the man backed away and slammed a heavy steel security grate over the register. Ben reached out, a plea forming on his lips. But the man was already pressing a phone to his ear, his lips moving in a frantic, silent report. Ben turned and bolted back into the street, hearing the heavy thud of a deadbolt sliding home behind him. The dark arteries of the city's alleys took him back in, smelling of trash, the sour tang of hopelessness. He dove beneath the heavy canvas flap of a technical van parked behind the rising bleachers. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of heated plastic and the sharp tang of ozone from the massive amplifiers. Ben crawled through a labyrinth of thick black cables that coiled across the floor like sleeping vipers. His fingers brushed the cold, brushed aluminum surface of a mixing console, its face illuminated by a constellation of green and red LEDs. He searched for the master microphone toggle, hoping his voice could still cut through the layers of Linda's lies. Outside, the muffled roar of the crowd and the first brassy notes of the city band began to swell. Ben froze when the long shadow of a man blocked the light from the van's door, and the sound of heavy, rhythmic breathing filled the cramped space. 2 guards in the black tactical gear of the corporation lunged, pinning Ben to the floor amidst the sensitive equipment. Ben drove his elbow backward, connecting with something soft and hearing a muffled grunt of pain. A heavy knee crushed his chest against a metal door frame, stealing his breath. During the frantic struggle, Ben's phone slid from his pocket and met the corner of a steel amplifier with a sickening crunch. He watched the screen go dark, the screen that held the only digital backups of the forged maps. Sharp shards of glass bit into his palm as he lunged for the broken device. The guards grabbed his wrists, twisting his arms behind his back until a bone-deep pop echoed in the small space. Ben made a desperate, lunging heave, tumbling out of the van and straight into a cluster of plywood stage decorations. Racks of heavy velvet Millfield flags toppled over him, burying him in a suffocating weight of blue and gold fabric. He rolled across the grass, knocking over decorative hay bales that exploded in a cloud of stinging golden dust. Behind him, the shouts of the guards and the rhythmic thud of combat boots echoed through the staging area. The festive crowd just beyond the barrier remained oblivious, their cheers rising as the lights dimmed for the main event. Ben pressed himself into the wooden support beams of the stage, the vibration of Linda Hayes's footsteps directly above him, rattling his teeth. The searchers were inches away, their flashlights tearing through the gaps in the canvas. Above him, a thunderous ovation shook the wooden planks of the platform. Linda began her keynote address, her voice projected through the massive line array speakers, vibrating in Ben's very marrow. She spoke of a golden age and new foundations, her words smooth as polished stone. Ben crawled deeper into the crawl space beneath the boards. Cobwebs and sawdust filled his mouth as he ducked a hand that reached through the joists to grab him. One of the pursuers caught Ben by the ankle, his fingers digging into the bone as he tried to drag him back into the light. Ben wrapped his arms around a steel support, listening as Linda promised the citizens a prosperity that was literally being bought with his silence. Through the narrow gaps in the floorboards, Ben could see the tips of Linda's polished navy pumps. She paused in her speech, a silence that felt like a held breath, and made a tiny, clinical gesture with her hand toward the floor. The look on her face, visible through a knothole in the wood, was devoid of any human warmth. She was directing the guards to finish the task with surgical silence. Ben saw two of the men draw short, matte black batons in response to her silent command. Linda resumed her smile for the invisible thousands, her fingers gripping the edge of the mahogany lectern until her knuckles turned a ghostly white. Ben realized then that he wasn't a friend or even a citizen to her anymore. He was a line item that needed to be deleted. The sky over Millfield erupted in a violent cascade of gold and emerald light. The first roar of the fireworks made the ground heave, swallowing Ben's involuntary cry of pain. A guard pinned him against a cold iron support, the metal biting through his torn shirt. The man's fingers clawed at the strap of Ben's satchel, trying to rip away the final physical evidence of the land theft. The sulphurous smell of gunpowder drifted under the stage, mixing with the heat of the pyrotechnics. Ben ground his teeth together, holding the bag with a strength born of pure spite, while the strobe light flashes of the overhead explosions momentarily blinded his attacker. Every boom from above felt like a hammer blow against his resolve. Ben felt the hot, metallic tang of blood in his mouth and the sour scent of the guard's sweat as they grappled in the dark. As the man's hand tightened around his throat, Ben didn't pull away. He lunged forward. His teeth sank into the fleshy webbing of the guard's hand between the thumb and forefinger. The sound of tearing skin and a sharp, high-pitched yelp of agony cut through the rhythmic bass of the fireworks. The guard recoiled, clutching his mangled hand, his balance faltering on the uneven dirt. Ben seized the heartbeat of a second, rolling away from the man's heavy knee. His heart hammered against his ribs as he kicked out, his boot catching the guard's kneecap with a dull crack. The man went down, and Ben scrambled toward the light. He spotted a narrow gap between the structural joists and forced his way through, the raw wood baring its teeth and shredding the shoulders of his jacket. Ben's fingers found the rusted, cold latch of a technical access hatch. He gripped the vibrating rungs of a narrow iron ladder that shook with every measured step Linda took on the stage above. He climbed, his muscles screaming, as the dust of decades rained down into his eyes and lungs. Above him, slivers of artificial light sliced through the floorboards, painting his face in jagged stripes of white. With a final, agonizing heave, he pressed his head against the heavy trapdoor, prepared to shatter the carefully crafted illusion of the Millfield harvest. The hatch cover hit the stage with a resounding boom, and Ben emerged from the underworld directly into the blinding glare of the spotlights. Linda Hayes froze mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open in a silent "oh" of shock, her prepared speech fluttering in her hand. Ben staggered, his eyes squinting against the oppressive whiteness of the lamps that reduced him to a shivering, broken silhouette. The sea of faces in the square blurred into a single, pulsing organism. Linda took a sharp, ragged breath, her political mask fracturing. But Ben was already at the microphone. The cold steel of the mesh touched his lips, and the smell of his own dried blood mingled with the expensive floral scent of her perfume. Ben reached into the front of his shirt and pulled out a wad of papers, their edges darkened by the dampness of the archive vaults. These were the sheets he had secreted away that first night. A final insurance policy against a woman he had once called a friend. The parchment crinkled in his trembling grip, releasing the sharp, nostalgic scent of naphthalene and old ink. He held the original cadastral records aloft, the authentic watermarks catching the light in a way the corporation's forgeries never could. Linda turned a sickly shade of gray, her eyes locking onto the seals she thought had been burned. Ben held the documents to his chest like a shield, the night wind catching the frayed edges of the truth. He leaned into the microphone, the sound of his ragged breathing amplified into a low, rhythmic thunder that rolled over the square. In a voice that cracked but did not fail, Ben shouted the name of the first councilman, whose signature graced the illegal land transfer. The sound, bolstered by thousands of watts of power, hit the crowd like a physical shock, freezing the city in place. The laughter and the festive shouting died instantly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a weight. Ben watched as people in the front rows stopped, their half-eaten festival food forgotten in their hands. Linda gripped the lectern, her knuckles white, as Ben's words fell into the crowd like stones into a dark well, stirring a deep, visceral anger. Linda took a sharp, aggressive step toward him, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She broke into a piercing scream, her voice straining to override the growing murmur of the crowd. She pointed a trembling finger at Ben's torn clothes and the dark bruises on his face, branding him a madman and a fugitive from the state asylum. She accused him of trying to sabotage Millfield's future out of a twisted sense of personal vendetta. Spittle flew from her lips as she demanded the citizens ignore the ramblings of a paranoid schizo. Ben watched her, seeing the raw, animal fear behind her eyes as her carefully cultivated image of the town's matriarch dissolved into a puddle of spite. Ben raised his arms high and flung the duplicate records into the air above the front rows. Hundreds of sheets, covered in the cold mathematics of bribes and kickbacks, took flight on the night breeze. The paper rain drifted down onto the heads of the stunned residents, rustling softly in the sudden quiet of the square. He watched as shopkeepers and mechanics snatched the pages from the air, their eyes scanning the columns of figures that detailed the theft of their heritage. Linda lunged to catch the flying evidence, but the pages slipped through her fingers like water. A low, rolling roar of realization began to move through the crowd as people found the hard proof of their betrayal. The white rectangles carpeted the stage like a sudden summer snow. Chaos erupted on the cobblestones when a global build foreman tried to wrestle a document away from an elderly farmer. Ben heard the sharp rip of denim and the first heavy thud of a fist connecting with bone. Pro-development factions clashed with citizens who were already shouting the names they found on the lists. The sound of the riot drowned out the last strains of the recorded music. Ben watched from the height of the stage as tables of food were upended, and red wine spilled across the stones like a dark, spreading stain. The square became a boiling cauldron of resentment, and every one of Linda's shrill commands only served to stoke the fire. Ben stood in the eye of the storm, watching the social fabric of his home tear apart. Linda gave a sharp, imperceptible nod to the officers flanking the stairs. Two policemen in heavy tactical gear swarmed Ben, pinning his arms behind his back with practiced efficiency. He felt the bite of steel handcuffs ratcheting shut around his wrists. They dragged him across the stage toward the rear exit, the sound of his boots scraping against the wood drowned out by the jeers of the crowd. Linda watched him go with a look of icy, detached triumph, smoothing her hair with a hand that finally stopped shaking. Ben felt the impact of a plastic cup against his shoulder as he was hauled down the steps. The officers shoved him into the back of a patrol car, the heavy door slamming shut as the riot on the square continued to burn in the dark. The first rays of the morning sun touched the porch of Ben's house, illuminating the frost on the railings and the jagged shards of the broken window. Ben stood there, leaning against the doorframe, one hand pressed against the dull ache in his ribs. From the far edge of the communal meadow, the rhythmic mechanical roar of diesel engines began to rise. He watched as the yellow steel of the excavators tore into the earth, their buckets swinging with a cold, mindless precision. The sound of ancient oak trees snapping under the pressure echoed through the valley like a series of gunshots. Birds erupted from the canopy in a panicked cloud. Ben breathed in the smell of fresh sawdust and exhaust, realizing that his truth had been no match for the inertia of greed. A black, polished limousine rolled slowly down the street, kicking up a fine veil of dust near Ben's gate. The rear window slid down a few inches, revealing the sharp, impeccable profile of Linda Hayes. Ben caught her eye, a gaze that was cold, victorious, and utterly untroubled by conscience. She reached up to adjust a new pearl necklace, a gift from the corporation for stabilizing the transition. She had kept her throne by promising the city's elite a share of the new spoils. Ben saw the corner of her mouth twitch into a ghost of a smile, before the tinted glass hummed shut. The car accelerated, whisking her away to another meeting, leaving Ben in the deepening shadow of his porch to watch the dust settle.